everyone. My name is Professor Benjamin, and I'm an associate professor at Community College of Philadelphia. I teach environmental conservation and geography. Today, I'm here to talk to you about carbon footprint. And in this video, we will discuss what is a carbon footprint, how we produce CO2 emissions, how you can reduce your footprint, what is a carbon offset, and lastly, we'll talk about what is a carbon tax. So let's get started. What is a carbon footprint? Well, it's the mark you leave on the environment. And usually we depict this mark by a footprint. And the footprint represents the amount of carbon emissions an individual, a business, or a country emits into the atmosphere. And when we reference carbon, we usually are talking about CO2, or what we call carbon dioxide. And this is what carbon dioxide looks like. So it's a carbon atom with two oxygen atoms that are covalently bonded through double bonds. CO2, or carbon dioxide, is a greenhouse gas. And greenhouse gases cause a layer in the atmosphere that traps heat at the surface level. And this causes our globe to become warmer. So our oceans become warmer, our land becomes warmer. And when our oceans and our lands become warmer, they regulate the climate. So global warming is what actually causes climate change to happen. And the more CO2 you produce, the bigger your footprint is going to be. So here's an example of what we call a carbon footprint. So you can see it's visually represented by a foot, and you can see all the different things that somewhat contribute to your carbon footprint. And they can include how you extract your water or the amount of water you use, your electricity, the amount of electricity you use, the way you transport yourself or transportation, your personal consumption habits, how much gas you use, how much fuel you use, how much waste you produce. So our consumption habits again. So this is what a carbon footprint consists of. So let's move to the next slide, and we're going to take a little bit about talk about how we produce CO2 emissions. So carbon dioxide, of course, is mainly produced through the burning of fossil fuels. But it can also be produced through what you eat, through the way you travel, and through anything you use or through your lifestyle that you lead. Air travel actually is a large producer of greenhouse gas emissions. And air travel actually has doubled since 1980, so more people actually travel by air than by vehicle, and that is because prices have come down in terms of air flight, right, travel. And in 2018, 1.04 billion tons of CO2 emissions were released through air travel. So air travel is definitely an issue. Vehicle travel is definitely right up there with air travel. And of course, depending upon the type of vehicle you have, determines how much carbon emissions you produce. So if you have a vehicle that's either a hybrid or a vehicle that gets more miles per gallon in terms of gas mileage, then you will have less of a carbon footprint than someone who has what we call a gas guzzler vehicle. If you use public transportation or you bike, then your carbon emissions are definitely way lower than those individuals who travel by air or who use a vehicle that does not get very good miles per gallon. Another way is the food that we eat. Individuals that eat a high red meat or a beef-filled diet actually contribute more to their carbon footprint. And the reason for this is that our beef production in the United States and throughout the world is done in what we call CAFOs, or these large animal feed operations. And beef production contributes significantly to methane production. And methane is a greenhouse gas emission. And half of the emissions from the food and agricultural sector is emitted through these concentrated animal feed operations, or CAFOs, these feedlots. Also, beef production, these cattle need large areas to roam. And what happens is that in a lot of other countries or developing countries, individuals actually cut down rainforests or forests to allow these individuals to raise cattle. And when we tear down trees or deforest, what happens is that forests or trees take CO2 emissions out of the atmosphere. So when we cut down or clear cut these forests, we contribute to greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions. Lastly, I want to talk about our consumption habits. If you're a big consumer, then guess what? You're contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and your CO2 and emissions as well as your carbon footprint. And there's a really good article from Scientific America that talks about that the U.S. Accounts for 5% of the world's population, but creates 1/2 of the world's solid waste. That's huge, is that we only have 5% of the world's population, but we contribute half of the world's trash. And that's a big issue. In the United States, we are really about consuming. And that is from high-end products to low-end products. So from your high-end clothing manufacturers, handbag companies, all the way through to your dollar store chains, etc., is that we really live on a linear system of consumption. And we produce CO2 emissions or carbon emissions through the entire process, from extraction to production, right? To throwing away that product. And then, of course, to the fact that that product doesn't get recycled. So really, the ways that we, again, produce CO2 emissions are through the burning of fossil fuels, through what we eat, through the way we travel, through the way we use things, or through our consumption habits. So if you look here, where the average American's carbon emissions come from, 28% is through transportation, 26% is through the stuff you buy. Remember, anything you buy has carbon emissions all along the cycle. As soon as the materials are extracted from the earth, all the way through to the disposal, there are CO2 emissions or carbon emissions that are being released through that whole entire process. 14% comes from food, 17% comes from home and cooling, and 15% comes from home and energy use. Here's a really great image of the world in terms of how many carbon dioxide emissions they produce. And I want you to take a look at the two huge circles that are right in the middle of your screen. And we're talking about the United States and China. I want you to look at this. And while the U.S. is down in terms of their CO2 emissions and China is up, I want you to think about our population compared to China's population. Is that there are 1.43 billion people in China versus 329 million people in the United States. So think about that for a second. 1.43 billion people in China versus 329 million people in the United States. For such a smaller population, we definitely should have a lot smaller of a circle in terms of our carbon dioxide emissions. And if you look, a lot of the European countries, while they have smaller populations, definitely have less carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see throughout the world in terms of size and their CO2 emissions. But I will tell you that the U.S. definitely has a lot of ways to go in terms of our carbon footprint. Our carbon footprint is the largest carbon footprint per person compared with the rest of the world. So how can you reduce your carbon footprint? You might say, I feel hopeless. How am I actually ever going to do this? Well, there are little ways, moderate ways that you can impact your carbon footprint, and then of course high impact practices. So low impact practices are, having energy efficient appliances, having energy efficient light bulbs. Moderate impact ones would be that you recycle. Instead of drying everything in a dryer, you hang dry some things. You could replace your car with a hybrid instead of having just a regular miles per gallon vehicle. If you could go to a smaller size vehicle, that would be great. And then of course we can move to high impact. If you can reduce your beef consumption, you really are going to impact your carbon footprint. You could switch to an electric car, which I know some of these are not feasible for college students, but you could switch to an electric car. You could buy green energy. You could avoid round trip transatlantic flights, so you could reduce your air travel. That's one way. You could also travel more by bicycle. So these are ways that you can reduce your impact in terms of your carbon footprint. The other thing you could do is you could offset your carbon emissions. Now, I was married in 2007, and we actually reduced we gave offsets. We bought offsets for our wedding. And I know that's a little extreme and sounds a little crazy, but carbon offsetting allows you to mitigate your climate impacts while giving back to nature and local communities. So we did a little math calculation. We figured out what the carbon footprint would be for our wedding. And then what we did was we gave to organizations that help reduce CO2 emissions. And so instead of giving a little favor at our wedding, we actually donated money to organizations that were able to offset carbon emissions. And there are a lot of these different organizations out there, from organizations that plant trees, to organizations that develop renewable energy, to organizations that capture CO2 emissions. So there's a lot of different organizations out there that can help you offset your emissions, to help you balance out what you're giving off or what you're producing, and then, it kind of reduces that by offsetting it. And it helps you live a more carbon neutral lifestyle. It's not for everyone, but it is good for you to know that there are ways that you can reduce your carbon footprint. The other thing I want to talk to you about is a carbon tax. And this has been proposed numerous times in the United States and in other countries. And a lot of times we don't even realize it, but we are being taxed on things that produce high carbon emission producing items. And so here's a really good example of what Canada has done, is that they actually have put the sin tax, we call it a sin tax, on things that produce carbon emissions. So education and health services have a 0.9% tax on them. It's almost like a sales tax that goes on items. And of course, the item that requires the more carbon emissions to create has a higher tax to it. And this is extreme, but it may be the way we need to move in terms of climate change for the world. Because a lot of people need that idea of some way to mutually coerce you to do the right thing. And so that is what a carbon tax is. And there are a lot of conversations out there happening about carbon taxes. And lastly, I want to end with a quote. The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. No one else will save the earth. We will be the ones who have to do it. So I want you to think about your carbon footprint and the ways that you can reduce your carbon footprint. Remember, while it's almost impossible to leave behind no footprint, it is our responsibility to leave behind the smallest carbon footprint that we possibly can for future generations. Thank you, and I hope you learn a lot about carbon footprint and how you can offset your carbon emissions.